Later in the program, we'll get to our debate over the long goodbye between the United Kingdom and Canada. But first, a hello to someone from the United Kingdom. Joining us now, Anthony Cary, the British High Commissioner to Canada. And we welcome you to TVO.
Thank you very much.
Nice to have you here, Commissioner. Now, let's start by reading the letter that you wrote to the Globe and Mail on the issue of our environmental policy. This was last month. Here we go. Your editorial, you write to the Globe, on climate change policy recognizes the significance of the Pembina Institute David Suzuki Foundation study, offering ways in which Canada might start to limit greenhouse gas emissions after years of inexorable growth. Yet you balk at the transformative changes the study says are needed to meet the government's target. That seems to me an extraordinarily timid and unimaginative conclusion. You say that Canada, quote, must not, in the service of international obligations, allow itself to be immolated by a government policy of such wrenching dislocation. Should you not rather be urging your government to press on with its transition to a low-carbon economy, both in fulfillment of its international obligations and in its own long-term national interest? Now, I guess what we found kind of interesting about that is that diplomats usually like to stay out of the limelight, but there you are kind of putting it out there on the pages of our national newspaper. Why'd you write that letter?
I read that letter because I was really rather shocked by the Globe and Mail's editorial that day. They seemed to say that this study on how Canada might fulfill its international obligations was a worthy and important one. It needed to be said, somebody needed to put a plan out there. But that because the implications were so transformative, were so radical, because they would have asymmetric implications across the country, it was therefore unthinkable, and Canada should not proceed, should abandon its international obligations, and should go for something more modest. Mm-hmm. And I just felt that, first of all, I think it's a bit feeble to say because it's transformative we should give up on it, because I think actually both in Europe and in Asia and in North America we need transformation. We've got to transform our economies if we're to manage the transition to low carbon. But it isn't just that it's got to be transformative, but we need the technology, we need the investment and so on, and I felt that that was also very important.
But when an ordinary person writes that letter, it's all well and good, but when the High Commissioner from Britain writes that letter, I mean, that can affect relations between our two countries. Has there been any flack as a result of this?
I mean, I wasn't attacking the Canadian government at all, but I was asking that the Globe and Mail should urge the government to press on with the agenda it's already embarked upon. So I didn't see it as a problem in terms of our bilateral relations.
Okay. Did you hear back from the Globe?
I heard back from another Canadian ambassador, but not from the Globe.
Okay. What have the British done on climate change? Enough in your view?
I don't know if it's enough because it's a huge undertaking, but what has happened in Britain has been a big reframing of the issue. An issue which was a few years ago seen as a sort of soft environmental issue is now really seen as a hard international security issue. We have a national security strategy which says that it sees climate change as the biggest threat that we face globally and the biggest threat therefore to national security. And we've had two prime ministers in a row who've really said this is an issue we've got to grip. It must be at the top of our foreign policy, at the top of our defense policy. It's the top agenda item for our Treasury, our Ministry of Finance equivalent. We've created a national department for energy and climate change, so it's now being dealt with by a single ministry to try to integrate our policy.
Doing better than Canada, you think?
Well, I mean, we took on a 12.5% Kyoto commitment, and we're going to deliver about a 25% reduction on our 1990 levels by 2012, which was the date for Kyoto, and we have undertaken to deliver a 34% reduction by 2020. But I have to say that that's not any particular virtue, because we were anyway going through a transformation of our energy supply to gas, which has lowered our carbon emissions, and we've been reducing our manufacturing, and we don't have anything like the distances you have here or the temperature, and we're not a major energy producer as you are. So I understand why it's much more difficult for Canada. But what I think is very important is this sense that we've really got, which I think we've really managed to communicate to the British public, that this is an issue which we've got to really grapple with. We've got to go through a transition, and it's going to be expensive, it's going to be difficult, but we've got to change the way that we live.
Let me follow up with something, therefore, from the Ottawa Citizen. The world needs Canada's so-called dirty oil, the International Energy Agency said Tuesday, even as it called on leaders to make decisive moves to slash greenhouse gas emissions. Without concrete actions to limit emissions, energy demand will jump by 40% between now and 2030, the IEA said in its report. Canada, with 178 billion barrels of proven oil reserves that ranks second only to Saudi Arabia, plays an important role on the supply side. The vast bulk of those reserves come from oil sands deposits, which produce 20% higher carbon dioxide emissions than conventional oil. Well, here's someone saying the world needs Canada's dirty oil. Do you agree?
I think, yes, the world does need Canada's oil. It needs Canada's energy. Certainly, we believe in a diversified and stable energy supply. And if that can include Canada's energy, that would be a good thing insofar as it reduced US dependence on oil from the Middle East, for example. But that's a slightly short-term thing. I think in the short term, we do need Canada's oil. But what I very much hope is that once carbon is properly priced into the world economy, the whole economics of energy will change, and some of the renewable energy sources will become much more efficient and much more competitive in the market. Because the problem with the oil sands is that most of the carbon coming from them is not in the gathering of them, not in the production, but in once the hydrocarbons are burnt. I mean, about 80% of the carbon emissions are in the using of the fuel. And insofar as the oil sands are adding to the stock of hydrocarbons, that's where the problem really resides. So what we need to do is to change the whole economic model so that the hydrocarbons become a much less attractive energy source.
One more excerpt for you here. I suspect you know Bjorn Lomborg, the so-called skeptical environmentalist who wrote in the Wall Street Journal not so long ago, getting basic sanitation and safe drinking water to the 3 billion people around the world who do not have it now would cost nearly $4 billion a year, $4 billion. By contrast, cuts in global carbon emissions that aim to limit global temperature increases to less than 2 degrees Celsius over the next century would cost $40 trillion a year by 2100. These cuts will do nothing to reduce the number of people with access to clean drinking water and sanitation. Cutting carbon emissions will likely increase water scarcity because global warming is expected to increase average rainfall levels around the world. Could the international community do more good with less expense by focusing on other problems besides global warming?
Well, the simple answer to that is yes, and we are concentrating on the other goals. I think the British government, it would be hard to fault it in its huge effort to deliver on the Millennium Development Goals, which include drinking water and sanitation and health. And incidentally, it covers sort of tetanus and TB as well as HIV and AIDS and so on. So yes, those are enormously important, and it certainly isn't an either or. I mean, we clearly have to live. No, it isn't either or. We unfortunately, it would be lovely if we could choose, and we'd say, oh, let's not bother with global warming. We'll just let it carry on. But the scientists suggest, and they may be wrong. I mean, I'm quite prepared to believe we still know very little about the science, and it may be that they're wrong. But just as a matter of risk management, the present consensus of scientists is that this is a very, very serious problem for the world. It's serious enough that, as I say, it's at the center of Britain's national security strategy.
But governments aren't great at doing everything. You know, they have to pick and choose their battles, right? Can you choose both of these huge battles at once?
Well, unfortunately, we have to. We can't just say, well, let's not bother with global warming. We'll stop working on that because it's all too difficult and all too expensive. Let's not bother. And then we find that actually we have driven temperatures in a way that leads to, for example, mass migrations of people because they can no longer live in the countries that they were living in, which leads to wars and so on. I mean, we don't believe it's a problem that can be ignored. And furthermore, while I accept that it's very expensive and difficult, it also creates enormous economic opportunities. So it's wrong to see it simply as a cost to the world economy. There is a real cost there, but the Stern report suggests that it's a perfectly manageable cost.
Okay,
but the longer we leave it, the more expensive it's going to be. And that's the other argument for moving soon, is that if we act well and radically now, it's liable to be much less expensive than if we leave it longer.
Sure. Should we have different carbon reduction targets for example, your country and mine versus developing countries?
Absolutely, certainly.
Cut them a break.
Definitely, and furthermore help them to manage the transition. I mean, just to give you some idea of that, we reckon, I mean, not just we, Canada and Britain and the whole of the G8 have now agreed that trying to restrict temperature rises to 2 degrees since the Industrial Revolution is the target that we should be aiming for, and that implies roughly a 50% cut in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. The developed world is going to have to deliver about 80% of that. So the developing countries, for the time being, will be increasing their emissions because they're still developing their economies. We hope that they can take on commitments to reduce the intensity of their emissions, and we hope that they can peak their emissions by about 2020. But certainly in the early stages, they are going to be contributing much more there'll be most of the new production of carbon will be coming from the developing world.
You talked a few moments ago about creating a carbon market so that we can start to get some our economic heads around how to handle this. But I'm wondering if you've got a view on the most effective ways of reducing carbon emissions. Do you like cap and trade? Do you like a carbon tax? Are there other ideas that you prefer? What?
I think the key thing is that carbon's got to be priced into the world economy, and you can do that in several different ways. Mark Jacquard, for example, here came up with arguments that it could be done through carbon taxing, it could be done through carbon trading, or you can do it with a mixture. And I think it's probably going to end up with a mixture. At the moment, we have a huge carbon trading taking place in Europe. I mean, it's now over $100 billion a year in carbon trading. But our carbon price is still only around $20 a ton, and that's not enough to drive the long-term investment that's needed. So I suspect that will need to be kept up with an additional carbon tax. And indeed, we already have a climate change levy on our utilities because the carbon credits in themselves aren't enough to drive the change that's needed.
We know that Copenhagen is coming, the UN Climate Change Conference at Copenhagen. Do you think that this is going to get serious consideration there?
Absolutely.
Are you confident something's going to emerge from there?
I can't be confident because, unfortunately, the US is not in a position yet to make the commitments that it's going to need to make. As you know, the health debate has sucked all the oxygen out of the American system.
And it's not over.
And it's not over. So I think it'll be very difficult for the president to make the sort of commitments that I think he would like to make, but he certainly doesn't want to make if he doesn't have congressional support, because he doesn't want to get into the position that happened last time around, where the United States made commitments that it wasn't able to deliver on. So it may be very difficult to get the sort of outcome we wanted, but Britain remains determined to have an outcome that will be ambitious, effective, and fair.
Do you know what they're going in with, Britain?
We're going in with the hope that first of all, it'll be a universal agreement that the whole world this time will sign up, because at Kyoto the great problem was that many of the major emitters were not a party to the agreement. So we want this time that the agreement should be universal. We want the whole world to agree on this 2-degree target as a target, and then to draw the implications from that about what sort of cuts are needed. And we think that needs about 80% in the developed world, as I said, and in the early stages, at least for the developing world, to try to peak their emissions by 2020. So we hope that countries will develop a consensus around those sorts of ideas, and then take on the commitments necessary. And in Britain's case, we've already said that we're willing to take on a commitment for 80% by 2050.
Okay, let me take advantage of the fact that you are here, because we're about to have a debate about potentially cutting ties to the mother country, or what the status of those ties are. And of course, we just had a royal visit over here. Prince Charles and his wife were just here. And I want to ask you whether you think, to the average Brit, Canadian-UK relations are still important.
I'd say rather sadly that I answer that to the average Brit, I think they're not that important. When I think about I have 4 children, and before I was appointed to this job, I don't think they had a very strong impression of Canada, frankly, which is sad. And I was thinking about why that was. And I think one reason is that they confused the Canadian accent with the American one. Where when they meet Australians and New Zealanders, they know at once who they are. Sure. When they meet a Canadian, they don't immediately say that's a Canadian. But I think the second reason actually is sport, that the sports that they're interested in, and sport is very important to children, are cricket, soccer, rugby, whereas the sports here are more hockey, football, basketball. So I think that's another reason why the connection is not as strong as it might be. But I think it's an enormously fruitful and important connection, and it's one that we should both be striving to develop, because I think it has great benefits for both of us.
Do you see, though, that as Canada becomes increasingly multicultural, that the ties to the Commonwealth, the ties to Mother England will be less and less as we go on?
I don't think for that reason. Britain too is also becoming increasingly multicultural. We're both changing as countries, but actually that multiculturalism is a very strong link to the Commonwealth, because we have many members of the Commonwealth who are now citizens of Canada and citizens of the United Kingdom. So, but I do think, nevertheless, that you have to put energy into a relationship, because obviously the links that were forged through ties of family and recent history 50 years ago aren't as strong now. So that's clearly the case. But I think that there's a lot that we can do to put energy into the relationship and keep it alive. And I think it's important, because I think both our countries, in fact all countries, gain strength from having roots into history and context, and it's sad when you lose those things. So I think it's worth maintaining, and there's an awful lot there. I mean, we shouldn't say that it's gone, because while I was saying my children don't have a strong sense of Canada, my businessmen jolly well do. We have a tremendous trade with Canada, huge investments in Canada. We're the second biggest investor in Canada after the United States. We're also the second biggest recipient of Canadian investment. So there's a lot of trade going on. There are a lot of family connections, a lot of personal connections, and there's a lot there to work on, and we need to continue to work on it and try to keep that relationship strong.
Anthony Cary, British High Commissioner to Canada. It's good of you to visit us at TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Very nice to be here. Thank you.